St. Petersburg, the early 18th century. On the walls of the new capital, the first images of the reigning monarchs begin to appear. Realistic, detailed, painted by European masters. Louis Caravac from France and Ivan Nikitin, sent to study in Italy, create canvases where the faces of the monarchs acquire flesh and volume. For the first time in the entire history of the state, rulers are given a documented likeness. Before that, emptiness. In Europe, portrait painting had flourished for centuries. The French Bourbons, the English Tudors, the Spanish Habsburgs had galleries of ancestors, where each ruler gazed from the wall, preserving the features of their time. In Russia, silence on the canvases. But in the museum's storerooms there are portraits of 17th-century Tsars: Sophia Alexeyevna, Fyodor Alexeyevich, Alexei Mikhailovich, Ivan V. The images hang in halls, are printed in textbooks, yet no one can say for sure who painted them and when. On the plaques, cautious, author unknown, late 17th, early 18th century. Presumably. The portrait of Sophia, the crown is not the one worn by Russian Tsarinas. Her hair is loose, unthinkable for a woman of the royal family. Fyodor Alexeyevich, the origin of the image is unknown, the dating is vague. Alexei Mikhailovich, who ruled for 30 years. All portraits are late copies of European engravings, not a single original. And a detail that unites all the portraits, the inscription, Empire of Muscovy, a Western term. Why do the images for the Russian court bear foreign labels? Honestly examining the absence of authors, the vague dates, the strange details, raises a question. Are these truly the faces of the Tsars? Or reconstructions created later when it became necessary to visualize a dynasty that had lacked a clear image for centuries? Take the portrait of Sophia Alexeyevna from the State Historical Museum. At first glance, a ceremonial depiction of a royal figure, but the details crumble into contradictions. The crown is of a shape not worn by Russian Tsarinas in the 17th century. Russian crowns had fur trim, a tall top with a cross, and heavy gemstones. Here, something between a Western diadem and theatrical props. Her hair is loose. In the 17th century, absolute taboo for a woman of the royal family. Sophia was a regent, ruling the state for 7 years. Her status demanded strict etiquette. Her hair should have been tucked under a kokoshnik or a scarf. No woman of high rank would have allowed herself such a thing. The clothing resembles more Western European fashion than traditional Russian attire. On the back of the portrait, no signature from the artist, no date. In the museum's description, unknown artist, late 17th, early 18th century. A span of several decades. Fyodor Alexeyevich, the elder brother of Peter, ruled for 6 years, died at 20. Reforms were carried out under him. The Boyar Duma was abolished. An educated Tsar, fluent in Latin and Polish. But the portrait? A mystery. The attribution is vague. Presumably late 17th century, author unknown. The technique of painting does not match Russian iconography or European schools. The face appears flat, lacking volume. Alexei Mikhailovich, ruled for 30 years. Invited foreign masters, translated books, opened theaters. Simon Ushakov created images with elements of realism. Conditions for a portrait tradition existed, but all known images of Alexei are copies from engravings. Western publications featured portraits of the Russian Tsar, and these engravings became the basis for later painted portraits. Ivan V, the younger co-ruler of Peter, sitting with his brother on a double throne. Sickly, nearsighted, in the shadow of Sophia and Peter. The portrait raises questions. The dating is blurred, the authorship unknown. Experts suggest it was created after his departure, as part of a dynastic gallery. The final detail. Inscriptions. Imperium Moscoviae, or Moscovia. A Western term. In Russia, different names were used. Why do portraits for internal use bear foreign designations? All these portraits share one thing: a lack of precise information. No authors, no dates, no evidence of creation. They are not documents of the era, they are reconstructions, made retroactively to fill the visual void of dynastic history. The answer to this question lies beyond Russia, because while Russian Tsars remained faceless on their own land, Europe knew exactly what they looked like. Year 1672. In Moscow, the Tsar's titular book is published, a lavish edition, a kind of encyclopedia of power, gathering images of all rulers Russia dealt with, from Byzantine emperors to contemporary monarchs. The book was created by order of Alexei Mikhailovich, crafted by the finest masters of the armory chamber. It seemed to be a testament to the high level of court artistry. Open the titular book. Look at the images. They are not portraits, not even attempts to depict real facial features. They are popular prints, primitive drawings where all characters look almost identical. Stylized faces, stiff poses, flat figures without volume or depth. European monarchs are depicted just as crudely as Russian Tsars. The artist clearly had not seen either. He simply stamped images according to a template. Compare this with what was produced in Europe at the same time. Amsterdam, Leiden, Nuremberg, Paris. Major centers of printing published engravings of rulers from various countries. And there, the Russian Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich looked completely different. Detailed face, realistic features, meticulous rendering of clothing and regalia. The engraving was executed professionally, with proper proportions, chiaroscuro, and textured fabrics. Where did European publishers get such accurate images? From diplomats who visited Moscow. From merchants trading with Russia. From artists accompanying embassies making sketches. Western masters recorded the appearance of the Russian Tsar because it was a routine task for them, to create engraved portraits for encyclopedias or newspapers. In Europe, a portrait was a tool of information, a way to convey to the public, what does this or that monarch look like? Yet, in Russia itself, the official publications created by order of the Tsar issued primitive engravings, where it was impossible to distinguish individual features. Paradoxically, foreigners knew the faces of Russian rulers better than their own subjects did. Take the engravings by Adam Olearius, a German traveler who visited Russia in the mid-17th century. His book, Description of a Journey to Muscovy, was published in 1656 and reprinted several times. It contains images of Russian boyars, scenes of court life, views of cities. The quality of the engravings is high, with carefully detailed work. Olearius did not merely imagine, he sketched what he saw. Or consider the engravings from Sigismund Herberstein's Notes on Muscovy, published as early as the 16th century. These also depict the Grand Prince of Moscow, boyars, court life scenes. The craftsmanship level is incomparable to what was produced within Russia itself. Why such a difference? Why could European masters create realistic images of Russian figures, while Russian artists could not? The explanation about lacking technological means doesn't hold up. Russia had a highly developed icon painting tradition. Semyon Ushakov, a court master working during Alexei Mikhailovich's reign, created icons with elements of three-dimensional painting, with shading, almost portrait-like rendering of saints' faces. The technique was there. The skill was there. But there were no portraits of the Tsars. The 1680s. In Europe, the greatest Baroque masters were at work. Peter Paul Rubens painted monumental canvases for royal courts. Diego Velázquez painted portraits of Spanish infantes with such precision that the tiniest details of lace and jewelry are visible. Rembrandt van Rijn in Amsterdam created psychological portraits, where the face of the person is revealed through light and shadow. Anthony van Dyck worked at the English court, leaving behind images of King Charles I and his family. These are not just paintings, they are documents of the era. Through them, one can study fashion, hairstyles, jewelry, interior architecture. The faces in the portraits reveal character, social status, how they wanted to be perceived by contemporaries and future generations. And in Russia, at the same time, silence on canvas. Alexei Mikhailovich ruled for nearly 30 years, carried out reforms, invited foreign specialists, opened the first theater. His son Fyodor continued the Europeanization. Sophia Alexeyevna practically governed the state for 7 years. All these figures were key players of their time, but not a single documented, dated, signed portrait made during their lifetime exists. Look at the portraits of French kings of that era. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who reigned for 72 years. Dozens of portraits painted by the best masters of the epoch. Every stage of his life is recorded, from young prince to old monarch. These portraits allow us to trace how fashion changed, how the style of court painting evolved, how the very king himself wished to present his image during different periods of his reign. Or the English Stuarts. Charles I, executed in 1649, left behind numerous portraits. Charles II, who returned to the throne in 1660, also actively used portraiture as a tool of authority. His images spread across the country, asserting the legitimacy of the restored monarchy. In Russia, nothing of the sort existed. Even after Peter the Great began a vigorous Europeanization, even after Western masters flooded into St. Petersburg, the previous generations of rulers remained faceless, as if, before Peter, the dynasty existed in some parallel dimension where visual documentation was impossible or forbidden. But here's the paradox. There was no ban, because there are images of Russians from that time, quite high quality. Portraits of boyars, voivodes, church hierarchs. They have survived. You can see them in museums. The technique is a hybrid, an icon and a portrait, but the faces are recognizable, individuality conveyed. If ordinary boyars could commission a parsuna, why not the Tsars? And here another version arises. Perhaps the portraits of the Tsars existed, but they did not survive. They perished in fires, were destroyed, lost. And convenient theory, but it collapses when confronted with facts. Because the portraits of boyars have survived. Icons from that era number in the hundreds. Courtly objects, clothing, weapons, utensils, all have come down to us from the 17th century. But the portraits of rulers, no. Coincidence? Or a system? Yet there are two portraits that shatter all these theories. Two images that prove, when it was necessary, portraits were created, of the highest quality, with precise dating, by known artists. False Dmitry I and Marina Mniszek. The pretender claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's son, and the Polish adventuress who became Russian Tsarina for a few months. Their portraits exist. They hang in the State Historical Museum in Moscow, dated around 1606. The artist is known, Szymon Boguszewicz, a Polish painter of Armenian descent, one of the leading masters of the Lviv school. The technique is impeccable. Faces are detailed, with volume and psychological depth. The clothing is rendered with jewel-like precision. The texture of fabrics, the shine of jewels, embroidery patterns are visible. The composition is carefully thought out. Proportions are correct. This is a genuine early 17th century European portrait, no inferior to the works of Western masters of the time. And here's the detail that turns everything upside down. The portraits bear inscriptions in Latin. Demetrius, Imperator Moscoviae. Dmitry, Emperor of Muscovy. Marina, Imperatrix Moscoviae. Marina, Empress of Muscovy. Emperor, not Tsar, not Grand Prince, an emperor. And Muscovy, the Western name for Russia, which the Russians themselves never officially used. It turns out that the pretender, who ruled for less than a year, was immortalized forever. A European master created a high-quality portrait, capturing the appearance of the figures, leaving aside the document of the era. And for some reason, the legitimate Russian Tsars who ruled for decades were not granted such a privilege. If a portrait of false Dmitry was painted during his lifetime, then the technology existed. Then, artists were accessible. Then, patrons understood the value of visual documentation. So why did the true Tsars go without portraits? The version about a religious prohibition crumbles instantly. If there was a ban, it should have applied to everyone, primarily to the pretender. The church did not recognize him, considered him heretic and a servant of the devil. But there is a portrait. High quality, detailed, professional. Perhaps the ban only applied to Russian masters, and foreigners were allowed? But then why didn't Russian Tsars invite European artists to create portraits? Alexei Mikhailovich commissioned architects, engineers, doctors, military specialists from abroad. Why not artists? Or was the prohibition selective? Could the pretender be depicted, but legitimate rulers, no? Absurd. Logic cannot withstand scrutiny. The only explanation remaining is that portraits of the Tsars were not created not because it was forbidden, but because there was no need. Or perhaps this need arose later, when it became necessary to visualize the dynastic line retroactively. And then they took European engravings, descriptions from contemporaries, their own imagination, and created a gallery of images meant to fill the centuries-old void. Now, let's return to the official version repeated in all textbooks. Religious prohibition. The Orthodox Church supposedly disapproved of depicting living people, equating portraits with idolatry. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, the second commandment. Here's your explanation for why Tsars weren't painted. It sounds convincing, until you start comparing it with reality. Open any album of 17th century Russian iconography. Thousands of icons, hundreds of churches painted from floor to ceiling with faces of saints, apostles, martyrs, righteous ones. Each church is a gallery of images. The image of Christ the Savior, the Virgin Mary, the saints of the church. Are these not idols in the literal sense? Are people not praying before them, kissing them, lighting candles? If the prohibition on images was so strict, where did the entire Russian iconographic tradition come from? Why could Andrei Rublev paint the Trinity, but court painters could not paint the Tsar? Compare this with Islam. There, the prohibition is truly total. In mosques, you will find not a single image of a person or animal. Only geometric patterns, plant motifs, Arabic calligraphy with quotations from the Quran. It's a consistent position. If you can't depict, then no one and nowhere can be depicted. In Orthodoxy, this was not the case. Icons existed for centuries. Their veneration was part of worship. The Seventh Ecumenical Council in the 7th century explicitly approved the veneration of icons, distinguishing worship of God from veneration of sacred images. That is, the Church officially permitted images of saints. But Tsars? No? Then explain the portrait busts. These are hybrid genres between icons and portraits, which appeared in Russia precisely in the 17th century. They were painted by boyars, voivodes, princes, and church hierarchs. The portrait of Prince Mikhail Vasilyevich Skopin-Shchuisky, painted around 1610, is one of the earliest. A detailed depiction of a specific individual, with recognizable facial features, dressed in rich attire, bearing symbols of authority. The portrait of Simon Ushakov, the icon painter who served at the court of Alexei Mikhailovich, exists. There is his self-portrait, created around 1670. The master painted himself. The church did not object. There was no prohibition. The portrait of Patriarch Mikhon, the head of the Russian church, the initiator of the schism, one of the most influential figures of his time. His image exists, and not just one. Painted during his lifetime or immediately after his death. Detailed, recognizable, with a nuanced portrayal of character. If the patriarch could be depicted, why not the Tsar? After all, in the worldview of that time, the Tsar was anointed by God, a sacred figure standing above all earthly authorities. His image should have been venerated no less than that of a church hierarch. Moreover, Alexei Mikhailovich actively promoted Europeanization. Foreign masters were invited to Moscow during his reign. Buildings in Western style were constructed. The first theater opened in 1672, and court performances based on Western plays began. Young boyars started shaving their beards and wearing European clothing. All this happened under a living czar, with his approval. Could a person who permitted theatrical performances, something revolutionary and alluring for many at the time, have forbidden the creation of his own portrait for religious reasons? During Alexei Mikhailovich's rule, Simon Ushakov worked, the greatest icon painter of the era. He created icons that incorporated elements of realistic painting, volumetric faces, chiaroscuro, attempts to convey space. His Savior Not Made by Hands from 1657 is almost a portrait, so detailed and realistic is the depiction of Christ's face. Ushakov could have painted the Tsar. He had the technique, he had the skill. But no portrait of Alexei Mikhailovich by Ushakov exists. Why? Were they not commissioned? Or were they commissioned but have not survived? Or were they destroyed? Fyodor Alexeyevich, son of Alexei Mikhailovich, ruled for 6 years, from 1686 to 1682. Under him, Europeanization continued. He abolished the prikazy, an ancient system of distributing offices based on noble rank, conducted a census, reformed the army, invited foreign specialists. He knew Latin and Polish, an educated, progressive ruler. But there is no official portrait from his lifetime, only later reconstructions by unknown artists. And now, think of Sophia Alexeyevna, regent, effectively ruling the country from 1682 to 1689. A woman who managed the state, received foreign ambassadors, negotiated, signed decrees. A perpetual peace was concluded with Poland during her reign, one of the most significant treaties of the era. 2 campaigns into Crimea were organized. Sophia was educated, ambitious, eager to consolidate her authority. If portrait painting had been accessible and permissible, she would have been the first to commission her likeness to legitimize her rule. After all, visual representation of power is a tool of governance. European monarchs understood this perfectly. Yet there is no portrait of Sophia created during her lifetime and verified by documentation. The only existing image is that dubious depiction with the incorrect crown and flowing hair, which we have already discussed. This suggests that the religious prohibition was merely a convenient excuse, one that does not withstand confrontation with the facts. The Church did not forbid depicting people. Icons were painted in the thousands. Portraits of individuals, parsunas, were created freely. Patriarchs, boyars, voivodes were depicted without issue, but czars? No. And this is not about religion. The matter lies elsewhere. Something that prompts reflection. Was there ever really a need to fix the image of rulers at that time? Or did this need arise later, when it became necessary to craft a visual version of the past to bolster new dynastic legitimacy? And here we arrive at the most crucial question. When did portraits of former czars actually appear? Not when they were supposedly painted, but when they truly emerged in museum collections, historical catalogs, and public consciousness. The answer will shock. Not before the 18th century, and in most cases, only in the 19th. Let's trace the path of how these images appeared. Peter the Great came to power in 1689, ruling alone from 1696. From the very beginning, he actively employed visual propaganda. Portraits of Peter were created in dozens. The earliest works were by foreign masters. The Dutchman Jan Vinyus painted the Tsar in his youth during the Great Embassy. Later, Gottfried Kneller appeared, who produced a grand portrait of Peter in England in 1698. Then came Jean-Marc Nattier, Louis Caravac, whom Peter specifically invited to Russia in 1716. Caravac became the court painter, creating numerous portraits of the emperor and his family. Simultaneously, Peter sent Russian artists abroad for training. Ivan Nikitin studied in Italy, returned to Russia, and became the first major Russian portraitist. His works no longer lag behind European standards. Same techniques, same mastery. In just a few decades, Russia went from having no portrait tradition at all to establishing its own school of painting. A phenomenal breakthrough. But here's the question. Why didn't this breakthrough happen earlier? Why was it necessary to wait for Peter? And then, the most interesting part begins. In the 18th century, at the court of Peter and his successors, a demand for visualizing the past emerges. The new empire needs historical continuity. St. Petersburg is built as a symbol of breaking away from Muscovite Rus. At the same time, the Romanov dynasty had to prove its legitimacy, its connection to previous generations. For this, portraits of ancestors were needed. But they did not exist. So, they began to be created. In the 1730s, 1750s, during the reigns of Anna Ioannovna and Elizabeth Petrovna, dynastic galleries were established in the imperial residences. Portraits of past Tsars were specially commissioned. European engravings, descriptions from chronicles, and the artist's own ideas of how a 17th-century Russian Tsar should look served as sources. Louis Karavac, the court painter, was commissioned to produce a series of ancestral portraits. He painted Mikhail Fyodorovich, the first Romanov. He painted Alexei Mikhailovich. He painted Fyodor Alexievich. All these works date from the 1730s, 1740s. That is, about 60 to 80 years after the events, when no living witnesses remained. How did Karavac know what these people looked like? Did he have models? Or did he simply imagine, relying on general ideas? Look at these portraits. All the Tsars are depicted in formal parade attire, with regalia, in static poses. Their faces are generalized, without individual features. These are not portraits of specific people. They are symbolic images of rulers. The artist was creating not documents, but iconography of authority. In the 19th century, the process continued. Romanticism brought a vogue for history and national past. The demand for visualizing Russian antiquities emerged. Artists painted historical scenes, created series of portraits of princes and czars. Vasily Troponin, Karl Bryullov, and other masters received commissions to depict rulers from the pre-Petrine era. But this was already overt stylization. 19th century artists painted a 17th century person as they imagined him, based on costumes from museum collections and descriptions from books. For the Armory Chamber in Moscow, a special series of portraits of Russian sovereigns was created. The work began in the 1830s. The goal was to present a visual history of the dynasty, from Rurik to Nicholas I. Artists copied old portraits when available. If not, they invented how a particular ruler might have looked. These portraits entered textbooks, historical albums, and the collective consciousness. When a modern person imagines Ivan the Terrible, Boris Godunov, or Alexei Mikhailovich, they see images created by 19th century artists. Not contemporary documents, not eyewitness testimonies, but reconstructions made 200, 300 years after the events. It turns out that the visual history of the Russian state before Peter was written in retrospect. The dynasty was given faces when it became politically necessary, not during the reigns of the Tsars, but generations later, when it was time to create visual legitimacy for a new empire. This is not a conspiracy. It is a common practice of constructing historical memory. Each era rewrites the past to suit its needs. The Romanovs of the 18th and 19th centuries shaped the image of their ancestors to suit their own interests. They created galleries, commissioned portraits, reproduced images. But if we set aside the pomp and look at the facts, an uncomfortable question remains. What were the real faces of the Russian Tsars? The ones seen by contemporaries, not their descendants. We will never know, because there are no documents, only versions. Versions painted in oil on canvas 100 years after the events. Now, Let's look at the moment when everything changed dramatically. Peter the Great did not merely reform the army, navy, and government administration. He established a fundamentally new visual culture of power. Under Peter, portrait painting became an essential attribute of the imperial court. Images of the ruler were reproduced, distributed to the provinces, displayed in government offices. The face of the monarch turned into a symbol of the state. It was not just decoration, it was a tool of governance. Over 25 years of active rule, Peter's reign produced more portraits than the previous 2 centuries of Moscow Tsars combined. Dozens of paintings, hundreds of engravings, miniatures, reliefs, medals. The entire country knew the emperor's face. Meanwhile, the painting technique remained on a European level. Ivan Nikitin, sent by Peter to study in Italy, returned in the 1720s and created portraits indistinguishable from works by Western masters. The same chiaroscuro, the same volume, the same psychological depth. It turns out that in just a few years, Russia leapt from having no portrait school at all to producing works of world-class quality. As if the painting technique had been imported ready-made and instantly adopted. But what about Peter's predecessors? Their portraits appeared later. Louis Caravac, working at the court since 1716, was commissioned to create a gallery of past Tsars. He painted Mikhail Fyodorovich, Alexei Mikhailovich, Fyodor Alexeyevich. These works date from the 1730s and 1740s. In 1817, in France, the Romanov suite was created, a series of engraved portraits of all the rulers of the dynasty, from Mikhail Romanov to Alexander I. The work was executed by a group of French engravers based on miniatures by artist Jean-Henri Benner. This was already a blatant retrospective, created 200 years after the reign of the first Romanovs. Why was it necessary to craft a visual history of the dynasty retroactively? The answer is obvious: for legitimacy. The new empire needed historical continuity. Petersburg, Russia had to prove its connection to Moscow, the dynasty, to demonstrate the unbroken line. But if there are no documents, they can be fabricated. Paint portraits of ancestors, place them in galleries, publish albums. Within a generation, these images would be perceived as authentic. No one would remember that they were not created during the lives of those depicted, but a century after their passing. Visual history is written by the victors, and the Romanovs of the 18th and 19th centuries crafted her as they needed. They created a gallery of ancestors designed to legitimize their rule. They filled the void of centuries with portraits painted from artists' imaginations. And we still accept these images as authentic faces of the Russian Tsars. Yet in truth, these are merely versions of the past, constructed by those who sought to control not only the present, but also the memory of what had been. So, what remains if we discard all these later reconstructions and attempts to retroactively craft a visual history? What's left is emptiness, a void spanning several centuries. From Ivan the Terrible to Peter the Great, a land without faces. A dynasty that ruled a vast empire, waged wars, expanded borders, enacted reforms. Yet it left behind not a single verified contemporaneous portrait. One could say the portraits perished in fires. Moscow burned countless times. Palaces, boyar chambers, churches, all consumed by flames. But then why do icons from that era survive? Why do we have busts of boyars? Why have vessels, weapons, manuscripts, books endured? Was the fire selective, destroying only the Tsar's portraits? It's possible the portraits were deliberately obliterated. During dynastic changes, palace coups, political purges. Such things happened in history. The new regime erases traces of the old. But the Romanovs came to power in 1613 and ruled until 1917. 300 years of uninterrupted dynasty. Who would benefit from destroying their own ancestors' portraits? Sophia Alexeyevna was overthrown and confined to a monastery. It's said her portraits were destroyed on Peter's orders. But then, why does at least one image survive, even if dubious? And why, along with Sophia's portraits, did the images of her father, Alexei Mikhailovich, and her brother Fyodor remain. The logic of revenge would demand erasing the entire lineage of the disgraced Tsarevna. No, it's not about fires or deliberate destruction. It's that the portraits simply never existed. And if they never existed, the key question arises: why? European monarchs understood the power of visual imagery. The king's portrait was a tool of authority. His images were distributed across the realm, hung in government buildings, reproduced as engravings and medals. Subjects needed to recognize their ruler's face. It bolstered legitimacy, fostering a sense of personal connection between monarch and people. Russian Tsars did not employ this tool. They remained invisible to their subjects, an abstract figure hidden behind the walls of the Kremlin. The name was known, the title spoken, but the face unseen. Perhaps that was the point? The Tsar as a sacred figure, inaccessible to the gaze of ordinary mortals. An image existing outside visual reach. Power expressed through decrees and actions, but not through the physical visage of the ruler. Or was the reason something else? Maybe the very nature of authority in pre-Petrine Russia was different. Not personal, but collective. Not tied to a specific individual, but embodied in the institution of the realm as such. And then, a portrait was no longer necessary. Because what mattered was not the person on the throne, but the throne itself. Peter changed everything. He made power personal. His reforms, his wars, his navy, his capital, all were connected to the personality of the emperor. And so, portraits became a necessity. A visual representation of the new authority, based not on tradition, but on the ruler's personal charisma. But along with this new visual culture arose a need to explain the past, to show that the new dynasty had roots, that the Romanovs were a continuous line of rulers, each leaving their mark. That's when portraits began to be created posthumously, filling the void with images painted 100 years after the events. We live in a world where visual history has become reality. Portraits from museum galleries migrate into textbooks, encyclopedias, documentaries. We look at these faces and think we know what Russian Tsars look like. But in truth, we do not see them. We see a version of the past crafted by those who came after. And the main question remains unanswered. What were the real faces of the Russian Tsars? We will never know, because they vanished along with their era, leaving behind not a single authentic image. Only silence and emptiness remain, and late attempts to fill that void with paint on canvas. I do not claim to know the truth. I am not trying to impose on you a single correct version of events. My task is to reveal facts that usually stay outside the scope of official textbooks and museum plaques. To lay out the cards before you and give you the chance to draw your own conclusions. History is not a static fact. It is a field for exploration, where every detail can be a key to understanding. The absence of portraits of Russian Tsars is not a coincidence or a trivial matter. It's an important marker pointing to something greater. Features of power, the nature of the dynasty, ways of shaping collective memory. What you do with this knowledge is up to you. You can accept the official version and ask no further questions. Or you can dig deeper, seek new sources, compare facts. You can look at familiar things from a different angle and discover that reality is more complex than it seems at first glance. The truth rarely lies on the surface. It hides in details, contradictions, in what is left unsaid. Sometimes, the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected places. Museum basements, forgotten archives, questions no one dared to ask. Subscribe. Don't forget to click the bell so you won't miss new investigations. Many mysteries and discoveries lie ahead. We will continue to seek clues, ask uncomfortable questions, explore what official science avoids. Because the truth is always nearby. You just need to want to see it.